Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Gomez Homies. I'm here with my friends again. Hello, Nelly.
Hi, Rebecca. How are you doing today?
I'm doing very good. I'm so excited to have you back.
I am so happy to be here, and I'm very excited about the book that we are going to discuss today. What's the title of this book, Rebecca?
Well, the title of this book is called Killers of the Flower Moon.
Let me tell you something. This book had such a great impact on me, and if there is one book that is going to make you feel all kinds of things, anger, happiness, hope, and despair, it is this one. I think the hallmark of a good book is one that can make you feel a mix of emotions as you read through it. I'm so excited that we're going to discuss it.
Killers of the Flower Moon is a non-fiction historical book written in 2017 by David Grann. David Grann is an American journalist who has a devoted fan base. He also wrote The Lost City of Z, which was made a movie back in 2016. This book tells us the true story of the Reign of Terror of the 1920s, during which many Osage Native members were killed in Oklahoma for their oil wealth.
The murders went ignored for a while. The government didn't pay much attention to this. Anyone who investigated the murders, they would just go and pretend to investigate, and then they just left it. Like, they just dropped the case as soon as it got a little bit complicated. Nobody dug a little bit deeper. So not much attention was given to these murders. So in this book, also, we're going to see and we're going to talk about the many injustices that the American people perpetrated on these Native Americans, including the government themselves. Like, these were government sanctioned injustices that were done on these people.
Yes, and the most shocking part about it, even though the whole situation is horrendous, was who was behind the murders.
Yes, when I realized, or when the book revealed who was behind the murders and who was the accomplice, I was really shocked and I couldn't believe what I was reading.
Yes, well, the story starts with the disappearance of Anna Brown. She was Molly Brown's sister. The story pretty much centers around Molly's family. Anna was the first member of the family to disappear and die under these mysterious circumstances.
Right, Rebecca. She was the first one, but not the last to die this way. But why were the Osage people dying, disappearing, and being murdered? It all centers around their wealth. How did they acquire this wealth, Rebecca?
Well, Nelly, in the early 1870s, the Osage were driven from their lands in Kansas to a rocky, presumably worthless reservation in northeastern Oklahoma, only to discover decades later that this land was sitting above some of the largest oil deposits in the United States. To access that oil, prospectors had to pay the Osage for leases and royalties. By the early 20th century, each person on a tribal roll began receiving a quarterly check. The amount was initially just a few dollars, but over time, as more oil was taped, their money increased a lot, from the hundreds to the thousands, until the tribe members had collectively accumulated millions and millions of dollars. In 1923 alone, the tribe took in more than $30 million, which today it equals more than $400 million. So during that time, the Osage were considered the wealthiest people per capita in the world.
So the history of how the Osage came to own this land that was rich in oil is actually an unpleasant one. So back in the 17th century, the Osage owned much of the central part of this country. So that's pretty much what is now Missouri, Kansas, Oklahoma, the entire area, and even farther west, all the way to the Rockies. In 1803, the Louisiana Purchase was made, and, much of this territory included the land that the Osage people owned. The president promised, the Osage people that they will be left alone, that they would respect their lands and their boundaries, that no harm would come upon them. But that is exactly what didn't happen. What actually happened, Rebecca, after the Louisiana Purchase?
Well, Nelly, unfortunately, 4 years later, Jefferson had broken his promise to the Osage that they would keep their territory forever. So they had to give up their territory between the Arkansas River and the Missouri River. and the Osage people had no choice but to sign the treaty or they would be declared enemies of the United States. And over the next 2 decades, they were forced to give up nearly 100 million acres of their land, and they were just left with a 50 by 125 mile area in southern eastern Kansas.
Right, so the US government assured the Osage that they would be able to remain in their home forever, but before long, the settlers started to come in and they just took over their lands. By 1870, the Osage were expelled from their lodges, their graves were plundered, and seeing all of this going on and not seeing that they had much of a choice, they agreed to sell their Kansas lands for $1.25 an acre. This wasn't good enough for the settlers, so they decided to massacre several of the Osages, they mutilated their bodies, and they scalped them.
Yes, so the Osage had to search for a new land, and the one that caught their attention was the 1.5 million acres that belonged to the Cherokee. They were interested in this land because they believed that the white settlers would not come and bother them as the area was full of hills, and they described it as a broken, sterile, rocky, and utterly unsuitable for farming. At this point, the chief declared that his people would be happy there since the whites would not attempt to take their land, and consequently, the Osage purchased the territory for 70 cents per acre, and in the 1870s, they began their exodus.
Right, so this was a very sad time for the Osage tribe of Indians. David Grant goes on to say that the air was filled with cries of the old people, especially the women who lamented over the fate of their children and the graves of their children because they were about to leave them forever. So this wasn't a happy trip. This wasn't a voluntary migration. The Osage had to leave their lands because of the intrusion of the white settlers, which was supported by the United States government.
So in the 1920s, the Osage were extremely wealthy. However, despite their considerable wealth, they faced numerous injustices. A federally imposed system of financial guardians was established, implying that the Osage were not deemed competent enough to manage and administer such wealth. The decision to appoint a guardian for a Native American depended on the amount of Indian blood in the property holder, meaning that a full-blooded American Indian was often viewed as incapable of handling their finances.
Exactly. And, this financial guardian system was not enough. The US government went as far as imposing additional restrictions on their wealth. They even started to limit the amount of money that they could withdraw annually from their trust funds. And this was regardless of their needs. Then you have the local officials that are trying to seize their fortunes. You have armed robbers that were always trying to rob them in the banks. Merchants would exploit them through price gouging. So there was a lot of greed over their money. All right, Rebecca. So now we are back in the 1920s after all of these things have been done to the Osage people. And the book begins with the murder of Anna Brown. Let's talk about that and the subsequent murders.
Well, Nellie, Anna Brown was the first victim. She was found in a ravine after being missing for 3 days. She was shot in the back of the head.
Correct, Rebecca. And this is just the beginning of Molly's woes when it comes to her family. Actually, her sister Minnie had died earlier from a mysterious wasting disease. It was suspicious because they thought that she had been slowly and deliberately poisoned by someone.
Well, Nellie, the next victim was actually Henry Rowan, and they had found him dead in his car, and he was also shot on the back of the head. He was another Osage that had head rights, and therefore he had a lot of money. And at this point, local detectives thought that they had a serial killer in their hand.
Yes, so Lizzie Q, who was Molly's mom, is also suspected to have been poisoned because she also died from a mysterious wasting disease, and it was also under suspicious circumstances.
And the most tragic death that has happened in Molly's family was the death of Rita Smith and Bill Smith.
Rita was Molly's sister.
Yes. And on a normal night, their house was blown up, leaving behind their 2 children. This led to a lot of fear in the Osage community because they were wondering if they were next. So they started putting lights around their houses, and they even had guard dogs. But unfortunately, the dogs were being poisoned and nobody knew.
Yeah, so this was an uncertain time for the Osage people. The worst part was that any investigation that was launched into these murders always came back empty. And anyone who came close to solving this mystery wound up dead as well.
Yeah, so for example, W. Vaughn had important information on who was behind the murders. James Bigheart, another Osage, actually had crucial information and evidence regarding the murders. He was poisoned, but managed to tell Vaughn and give him crucial evidence before dying. But before Vaughn could inform anyone, he was pushed off a train. He broke his neck and died.
So the murders got a lot of media attention, and it got the attention of J. Edgar Hoover, who was the director of the Bureau of Investigation. He assigned a detective by the name of Tom White to head the investigation and to get to the bottom of everything that was going on.
And during his investigation, he discovered a very shocking thing.
Yes, so during his investigation, Tom White discovered that the previous detectives that have been investigating, they didn't follow the leads. They just let them die. They just didn't do a thorough job. They just didn't give this any importance at all. So Tom White followed the investigation, he followed the leads, and he followed the evidence. And he found out that the mastermind behind these crimes was William Hale.
So, William Hale was considered a friend of the Osage. He was a very wealthy man. He would donate to the charities, schools, hospitals before the Osage became rich. And he was actually Molly's husband's uncle. So, Molly considered him as a very close friend, even family.
In addition to that, William Hale had a really tight grip on his nephew Ernest, who was Molly's husband.
Yes, and because of that, he was able to pressure him into being an accomplice into exterminating Molly's family. And the reason he did that is so that Molly could end up inheriting all the head rights of her family that had been deceased, and then the plan was to kill Molly.
Exactly, and it turns out that she was already being poisoned throughout this time, but the poisoning was not successful because the investigation came to a close before she could be murdered.
Yeah, so William Hale denied any involvement in these murders and he never admitted it.
Ernest, on the other hand, was ridden with guilt, but he was also under the pressure of his uncle. So he would confess and then recant, confess and then recant, and then he finally did one final confession. He confessed to everything, and he told everyone how his uncle was the mastermind behind all of this. So they were both sentenced to 20 years in prison for this. And some family members say that after being released from prison, William Hale said that if it wasn't for Ernest's big mouth, they would all be rich. What do you think about this story, Rebecca? How does this make you feel?
Well, to be honest, I feel very sorry for Molly and her family for all the things he had to go through and how it was greed that drove this man, William Hale, to commit all these horrendous murders.
Yes, so it is sad to think that her whole family pretty much was exterminated in a short period of time because there was this enormous greed for their money. And what makes me more angry and feel, even more sorry for them is that the history of how they have been treated, by the government, by the other American people, is what allowed for all of this to happen, and it's what allowed for these people to get away with all these abuses for so long.
Yes, another thing that I find really crazy is that they only got 20 years. Only 20 years in jail. That is nothing to what they will be sentenced to in our time right now.
Right. So, it's sad to think that things haven't really changed much for the Native Americans and for minorities in this country, but hopefully, things can get better and, people will gain more knowledge about the history of this country so that we can all work together to make things better for everyone, not only a certain group of people, but for everyone that lives here. Thank you so much for having me, Rebecca.
Of course, it was so nice to have you.
Thank you, and I will see you next time.
Bye.